On the morning of February 1st, 2026, a family in Tucson, Arizona woke up and could not find their mother. There was no broken window, no kicked-in door, no overturned furniture, no sign that anything in the house had been disturbed at all. Just a phone left on a nightstand, a pair of hearing aids sitting where they always sat, a car still parked in the garage, and on the front porch, almost easy to miss if you were not looking, a few small drops of blood on the concrete. That was all. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old, was gone. Authorities ruled out the possibilities one by one. She did not wander off. She was not confused. She did not leave on her own. Within hours, investigators arrived at a conclusion that would grip the entire country. Nancy had been taken from her home in the middle of the night by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But here is where this story becomes something different from the kidnapping cases you think you know, because as investigators began pulling at the threads, they did not find a crime of impulse. They did not find a stranger who got lucky. What they found, piece by piece, was something far more calculated. A plan that had been months in the making, a target that had been studied, located, and chosen on purpose, and a trail of evidence that reached back not to the night of the crime, but to a Tuesday afternoon in October when a television camera crew walked into the oldest Mexican restaurant in America and filmed a warm family lunch that millions of people eventually watched. This is the story of how Nancy Guthrie became a target. It is a story about surveillance and betrayal and the terrifying vulnerability that comes with living in a world where a 6-minute segment on morning television can hand the wrong person everything they need to destroy your life. We're going to walk through all of it: the security gate that was never broken, the doorbell camera that was manually switched off in the dead of night, the FBI canvassing a neighborhood for dates a full month before the crime, the hired informant, the Google searches, the restaurant, and the California connection that investigators have been following quietly while the public looked elsewhere. By the time we are done, you will understand not just what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but how it happened. And that second question is the one that should keep all of us up at night. Before we go any further, if you have been following this case or if this is your first time hearing about it, subscribe and turn on notifications for Notebook V. Every week we go deeper than the headlines, and trust me, on this one, the deeper you go, the more disturbing it gets. Now, let's start from the beginning. Nancy Guthrie was not famous. That is the first thing you need to understand about her, because everything that follows depends on it. She was not the kind of person who appeared in newspapers or gave interviews or had a public profile that strangers could find with a simple search. She was a private woman, a grandmother, a faithful churchgoer who showed up every Sunday without fail, a woman who had lived in the same city for over 50 years and loved it the way people love a place that has shaped them completely. She had called Tucson home since the 1970s. She lived in the Catalina foothills, a quiet, affluent residential neighborhood north of the city, the kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where houses sit behind mature desert landscaping, where life moves at a pace that feels deliberately removed from the noise of the rest of the world. She had been in her home for decades. It was not just where she lived, it was who she was. Her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is one of the most recognizable journalists in America, co-anchor of The Today Show on NBC since 2012, more than 13 years on national television, one of the most documented salaries in broadcast journalism. Savannah is the public figure. Savannah is the name people know. Nancy was the woman behind that name, the mother who raised her in Tucson, the woman who watched the javelinas eat her garden plants and laughed about it, the woman Carlotta Flores, chef at El Charro Cafe, described to the New York Post in the weeks after the disappearance. "If you think about your grandmother," Flores said, "that's the way Nancy is. A humble, proud mom who only wants good things for her family. She's proud of her children. She just happens to have a daughter who's in the limelight." She just happens to have a daughter who's in the limelight. That sentence, spoken with warmth and affection, turns out to be one of the most important sentences in this entire case, because for whoever took Nancy Guthrie, that was not incidental. That was the point. Nancy also had another daughter, Annie Guthrie, who lived just a couple of miles away in Tucson with her husband Tommaso Cione. Tommaso taught science and biology at a local school. He had been part of the family for nearly 2 decades. He was, by all accounts, a good man, a steady presence, someone Nancy trusted completely. And Nancy herself, 84 years old, a pacemaker implanted in her chest and linked via Bluetooth to an app on her phone, daily heart medication she could not go without, hearing aids that she removed every single night before bed, leaving her completely and utterly deaf to anything happening around her while she slept. She was not a woman who could disappear and simply be fine. She was a woman who had been living quietly and privately in the same corner of the Arizona desert for half a century, connected to one of the most prominent journalists in the country, dependent on medication and medical devices to stay alive, and completely, totally unknown to the wider world. When investigators arrived at Nancy's home on the morning of February 1st, they did something that experienced law enforcement professionals always do at a scene like this. They looked for how someone got in. They examined the points of entry. They checked the windows. They checked the doors. They looked for the signs of forced entry that almost always accompany a crime of this nature. What they found stopped them. Nancy's home had a security gate mounted in front of the main entrance door. This is not unusual in Arizona. Homes built in the Tucson area during the 1970s and 1980s frequently have them. Heavy metal construction, wrought iron or steel mesh, steel frame, a deadbolt lock that, when engaged, makes the door behind it almost secondary. When that gate is properly locked, getting through it without power tools, without a crowbar, without making an enormous amount of noise that any neighbor within range would hear, it is essentially impossible. Neighbors who had the exact same gate on their own homes were asked about it. The answer was consistent. You do not kick that gate in. You do not pick that lock in a matter of seconds. You do not get through it quietly, quickly, or without leaving marks. The gate at Nancy's home was completely intact. No pry marks anywhere on the frame. The mesh was uncut. The steel had not been bent. There was not a single physical indication that anyone had forced their way through it, which means one of two things happened that night. Either the man who appeared on the porch had someone on the inside who opened that door for him, or there was already someone inside the house with Nancy when the figure outside arrived, and that person's job was not to break in, but to bring her out. The FBI worked with Google engineers for 10 days to recover what was left on that disconnected doorbell camera. 10 days of forensic digital reconstruction, pulling residual data from a device that was never supposed to capture what it captured. What they found was released to the public on February 10th by FBI Director Kash Patel. A man standing on Nancy Guthrie's front porch in the early hours of February 1st, masked, gloved, wearing a jacket and long pants despite the Arizona night, carrying a 25-liter Ozark trail backpack on his back, a gun in a holster positioned on his right hip. He stood at that door in the dark with everything he needed and waited. Former FBI Special Agent Johnny Grusing, who spent 25 years in the Denver field office investigating violent crimes and missing persons, analyzed that footage publicly, and what he found when he looked carefully went well beyond what most people noticed. The gun was holstered wrong, not slightly wrong, tactically significantly wrong. It was positioned at the front of the body, on the incorrect side, in a placement that would make drawing and firing accurately, especially while wearing gloves, genuinely difficult. Grusing was direct about what that means. Someone with real training, someone with military experience, or a professional criminal background with proper weapons instruction does not carry a gun that way. The weapon was not there for use. It was there for fear. It was a prop designed to make an elderly woman comply, carried by someone who understood conceptually that he needed a gun for this operation, but lacked the experience to carry it correctly. That detail matters enormously because it tells you something about who this man is. He prepared. He showed up with a mask and gloves and a backpack and a weapon and a plan. But the plan was not his. The preparation was not his instinct. He was following instructions written by someone else. Look at what he did with the camera. He did not smash it. He did not rip it from the wall. He raised his hand and tried to cover the lens with his palm, and when that did not work, he reached into a nearby potted plant and used branches to obstruct the view. Branches from a pot on the porch. He improvised a solution that was quiet, that was controlled, that bought him the window of time he needed without creating noise or destruction that might draw attention. That is not panic. That is deliberate, careful thinking under pressure. It's the behavior of someone who had been told, do not make noise, do not destroy anything you don't have to, handle the camera and then proceed. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin Daffer put it plainly. What the video reveals, she said, is the signature of someone executing someone else's plan. He shows preparation, but also clear tactical inexperience. He's a soldier, not the architect. And then there is the approach to the door itself. Grusing noted that the body positioning, the way the suspect stood at the entrance, the angle of approach, suggested something specific about his initial intention. He was not immediately attempting to force entry. The behavioral read, based on posture and positioning, was that he was trying to get Nancy to open her door herself, knocking, perhaps, ringing the bell, concealing his masked face until the moment she responded, counting on the confusion of an 84-year-old woman woken in the middle of the night, deaf without her hearing aids, opening her door to find out what was happening. He knew she lived alone. He knew her age. He knew the layout of the property well enough to approach the camera-facing entrance and deal with it immediately. He came with a 25-liter backpack to the home of an 84-year-old woman, which is capacity enough for materials intended for an extended operation, not a quick grab and run. There are also reports, not fully confirmed but investigated by law enforcement, of a neighborhood-wide internet blackout on the night Nancy vanished. If accurate, it suggests the use of a signal jammer, a device that would explain why other security cameras in the surrounding area failed to capture any getaway vehicle. Signal jammers are not purchased at a home store. They are not the tool of someone acting impulsively. They are the tool of an operation that anticipated surveillance and planned around it in advance. This was not a nervous amateur who got lucky on a random night. This was a coordinated strike against a specific target, executed by someone following a detailed plan, equipped with tools that required forethought, and operating with a level of knowledge about Nancy Guthrie's home and habits that could not have come from a single evening of observation. Part 4. The surveillance. Which brings us to January. The FBI did not limit their surveillance requests to the night of the crime or the days immediately surrounding it. They went back much further, significantly further. Investigators began canvassing Nancy's neighborhood and requesting footage from neighbors going back to January 1st, 2026, a full calendar month before Nancy was reported missing. They were not casting a wide net out of caution. They were looking for something specific. They had a theory about a specific person at specific locations on specific dates, and they needed the footage to confirm it. Two dates came up again and again in those conversations with neighbors, January 11th and January 24th. Multiple neighbors confirmed being approached by investigators and asked directly about footage from those dates. One neighbor told NBC News she was asked specifically about January 24th, 1 week before Nancy was last seen. The broader canvas went back to the start of the month, but those 2 Saturdays were the focus. Saturdays. Brian Anton of News Nation, one of the few journalists who had been consistently ahead of this case from the beginning, noted something about that detail that's worth sitting with. Investigators seemed specifically interested in weekends, not weekdays, which raises a question that Anton posed directly. Is it possible investigators believe this person had a job during the week and was casing the house on his days off? That question reframes the suspect entirely, not a professional criminal operating outside normal society, potentially someone with a regular life, a regular schedule, a job that kept him occupied Monday through Friday and free on weekends to drive to a residential neighborhood in the Catalina foothills and watch. Property cameras on and around Nancy's home captured what investigators needed to see: images of unidentified individuals on her property on at least 2 separate occasions before the abduction. Not the same masked figure from the doorbell camera. Different images, different dates, different circumstances, but the same conclusion. Someone had been to that house before. Someone had come back. Someone who appeared in that neighborhood on January 11th and again on January 24th was not lost, was not passing through, was there because they already knew that was where Nancy Guthrie lived, and they were confirming what they had come to confirm. The Catalina foothills is not a neighborhood you stumble into. It sits north of the city, residential and deliberate, the kind of place you go when you have a destination in mind. A stranger with no connection to that area does not drift through it on a Saturday morning by accident. A stranger who appears there twice, 3 weeks apart, is not drifting at all. Sheriff Chris Nanos, speaking to NBC News in mid-March, said something that stopped everyone who heard it. Investigators believed they understood why Nancy Guthrie was targeted, he said. He declined to reveal what that motive was. And then he added, "Don't think for a minute that because it happened to the Guthrie family, you are safe." That's not the kind of thing a sheriff says when the investigation. We are about halfway through, and this is where the story gets truly unsettling. If you are watching on Notebook Vid and you have not subscribed yet, do it now. We cover cases like this every single week, and what is coming in the next section, the restaurant, the Google searches, and the hired informant, is where the whole picture finally comes together. Stay with us. Part 5. The Mexican Restaurant. To understand how someone found Nancy Guthrie, you have to go back 3.5 months before she disappeared. You have to go back to a Tuesday afternoon in October, to a dining room inside a restaurant that has been standing in Tucson since 1922, to a moment that millions of people watched on television and almost nobody understood the significance of until it was too late. On October 17, 2025, Savannah Guthrie returned to Tucson. NBC's Today Show was running a series called Homecoming Today, in which anchors went back to the places that had shaped them. For Savannah, that meant Tucson. The filming took approximately 8 hours and moved through multiple locations across the city. It started at sunrise at Saguaro National Park. It moved through the Arizona Sonora Desert Museum. It ended at the University of Arizona, her alma mater, where the marching band played and her old sorority turned out to welcome her back. And in the middle of the day, the crew came to El Charro Cafe. El Charro is not just a restaurant. It is a Tucson institution in the deepest sense of that word. Founded in 1922 by Monica Flynn, it is the oldest continuously family-owned Mexican restaurant in the United States, more than 100 years under the same family. a landmark that Tucson residents are proud of, the way people are proud of things that outlast everything around them. When Savannah Guthrie says on national television that El Charro is the perfect place to catch up with her family, she is not describing a meal. She is broadcasting a location that anyone watching can find on a map in 30 seconds. The dining room where the filming took place was closed off from general customers that day, but the restaurant itself was open for business. Roughly 50 people were present, eating lunch, going about their afternoon, aware that something was happening nearby because a major network camera crew inside a beloved Tucson landmark was not exactly invisible. The Tucson Daily Star covered the filming in real time. News of the crew's presence circulated locally. People in and around the restaurant knew that Savannah Guthrie was there with her family. At that table, Savannah sat with two members of her family, her mother, Nancy, and her sister, Annie. For several minutes on what would become national television, Nancy Guthrie appeared on screen. She answered her daughter's questions. She talked about what made Tucson feel like home. She said the air, the quality of life, the way everything felt laid back and gentle. She joked about the javelinas eating her plants. She raised a prickly pear margarita and said, "Cheers." She was warm and present and entirely herself, an 84-year-old woman sitting in her favorite restaurant in her city, laughing with her daughter on camera, completely unaware that anything about this moment could ever be used against her. The segment aired on NBC on November 5, 2025. It ran on the Today Show YouTube channel. It was clipped and shared across platforms. And after Nancy disappeared on February 1, 2026, it went viral in the most painful way imaginable, watched and rewatched by millions, trying to understand how a crime like this could happen to a family like this, studying every frame for clues, feeling the weight of every ordinary moment in that restaurant, knowing what came after. News Nation correspondent Brian Anton, who had been consistently ahead of this case since the beginning and whose sourcing had held up repeatedly across weeks of coverage, reported on March 11, 2026, that investigators had gone back to the locations where the Today Show filmed in the fall, including what he described as the Mexican restaurant. He reported that the FBI had been there, that agents had asked specific questions, and that those questions were not routine follow-up. They were behavioral. Was there anyone here who looked suspicious when Savannah was filming with her mother? Did anyone want to take pictures? Did anyone get angry? Was anyone lingering in a creepy way? Read those questions carefully, not because they confirm a suspect, not because they resolve anything, but because of what they reveal about the shape of the investigation. Those are not questions you ask when you are tying up loose ends. Those are not questions that come from a procedural checklist. Those are the questions you ask when you have a specific theory about a specific person at a specific location on a specific day, and you are trying to confirm that someone else noticed him too. The restaurant's management, specifically Ray Flores, president of the parent company, told the Arizona Daily Star that no one from law enforcement had contacted El Charro at all. His words were direct: "We would have talked to the FBI. They never called us." The FBI, as standard practice in an active investigation, declined to comment. This conflict between Anton's sourcing and the restaurant's account has not been resolved. Both things cannot be entirely true. Either the outreach bypassed management and went directly to individual employees, or there's a gap in the chain of communication that has not been explained. But here's what that conflict doesn't change. The questions Anton describes reflect a real investigative theory, a theory that someone was present in the vicinity of El Charro on October 17th and was paying attention to the wrong person, not to Savannah, not to the cameras, not to the spectacle of a national television production unfolding inside their favorite restaurant, to the woman sitting across the table from her famous daughter, the humble, private 84-year-old woman from Tucson who just happened to have a daughter in the limelight. think about what the behavioral flags actually mean. The photography question is a surveillance indicator. People in the process of targeting someone document them. They photograph the person, the environment, the entry and exit points. They create a visual record. A person at El Charro that afternoon who was not photographing the cameras or the crew or the famous anchor, but was specifically tracking and capturing images of the elderly woman at the table, that person was doing something that would tell them which direction Nancy went when filming ended, what car she got into, which way she was driven, where she might live. The anger question points to what behavioral investigators call an entitlement response. Someone fixated on a target who is then blocked from getting closer by the logistics of a closed filming environment, by staff keeping bystanders at a remove, sometimes reacts with frustration that looks disproportionate to the situation. It looks from the outside like someone having a bad day, but in a restaurant full of people simply enjoying their afternoon, a person who becomes visibly agitated because they can't get closer to a specific individual at a specific table stands out. It registers, and in the context of what came later, it can look like something else entirely. The lingering question is the most straightforward and the most telling. Someone who stays past the point where staying makes sense, who positions themselves to maintain a line of sight to a particular person after the obvious reason to remain has passed, who does not leave when the filming wraps. Restaurant employees are perceptive in ways that are easy to underestimate. Years of watching rooms full of people trains a kind of instinct for when someone's presence has shifted from ordinary to something harder to name. The FBI asking about lingering means they believe that someone at El Charro on October 17th may have been noticed as off, not threatening, not alarming, just off. And that quiet, hard-to-articulate feeling, in the context of everything that came after, may now be evidence. The timeline that connects El Charro to February 1st is not complicated once you lay it out. October 17th, filming at El Charro. Nancy Guthrie sits at a table inside a closed dining room of a public restaurant, visible to the broader lunch crowd. Her presence in that city on that day known and reported by local media. November 5th, the segment airs nationally on NBC. Millions of viewers watch. The YouTube clip spreads across platforms. Anyone who missed the October filming now has access to a detailed, warm, nationally broadcast portrait of Nancy Guthrie, where she lives, what she looks like, how old she is, who her daughter is, what restaurant she loves, what she said about her city, and what it feels like to be her. January 11th, an unidentified person appears in Nancy's neighborhood. January 24th, they come back. February 1st, they come one final time. That is not coincidence. That is a timeline. Now we get to the question of how someone turns a television segment into operational knowledge about a private person's home address, daily schedule, and medical vulnerabilities. Because watching Nancy Guthrie on the Today Show tells you she exists and where she lives generally. It does not hand you her address. It does not tell you when she is alone, or what her front door looks like, or which neighbors have security cameras facing the road. That information came from somewhere else. Investigators found a Google search on a suspicious device that had been used to look up two very specific things: Savannah Guthrie's salary and Nancy Guthrie's home address. Not general information about the Guthrie family, not background on Savannah's career. Two targeted searches, the kind of searches you run when you have already decided on a target and you need to fill in the operational details. How much is the daughter worth, and where does the mother live? Savannah's financial profile required almost no effort to find. She had been co-anchor of the Today Show for more than 13 years. Specialized publications had reported her salary, estimated at several $1 million annually, and her net worth, approximated at around $40 million, for years before Nancy disappeared. It was not hidden. It was not private. It was the result of a single search and 30 seconds of reading. Nancy's address was different. County property records in Pima County are public documents, accessible to anyone. Her name, her property, her address of 50 years, findable, not hidden, not protected, just sitting in a public database that nobody ever imagined would be used this way. But public records and Google searches only get you so far. They tell you where someone lives. They do not tell you when she is alone, whether she wears hearing aids at night, what her pacemaker is connected to, what her routines look like from the inside, what the security gate on her front door operates like, or which neighbors on her street have cameras pointing toward the road. That information, the information that makes a plan like this not just possible, but executable, that information does not come from a database. It comes from a person, someone who knows, someone who is close enough to the world Nancy inhabits that the details of her life are simply part of the conversation, someone who, at some point, made a decision. The FBI was precise about the language they used. They did not say someone shared information about Nancy. They did not say someone passed it along carelessly. They did not say leaked. They said hired. That one word changes everything. When you hire someone, you pay them to do a job. Money goes one way, the work goes the other. It's a transaction, a deliberate, calculated, conscious decision by one person to sell what they know about someone they are trusted to protect. This is not an accident. This is not a mistake. This is a deal. Investigators looked at everyone close to Nancy. That's standard practice. You begin with the people nearest to the victim and work outward. And one of the first people they examined closely was Tommaso Cian, her son-in-law, the last known person to have contact with Nancy before she disappeared. In a case like this, that position puts you at the top of the list immediately. They looked at him hard. They asked difficult questions. They checked his account from every angle available to them. And then they cleared him. No motive, no record, nothing that connected him to what happened to Nancy. He moved from the top of the list to off the list entirely. The family, Sheriff Nanos stated clearly and publicly, was not involved. Any suggestion otherwise he called cruel and baseless. But clearing Tommaso did not close every door. It changed the question. The question was no longer whether Tommaso had done this. The question became, who does Tommaso know? Dominic Evans had known Tommaso for 17 years. 17 years is not an acquaintance. 17 years is the kind of friendship where you know someone's world without having to ask about it, where the details of their family life become part of the background of every conversation, where you sit at their table often enough that their routines, their concerns, their relatives, their home become as familiar as your own. Dominic Evans was 48 years old, a teacher and the co-founder of a band with Tommaso, something built on shared time and shared trust across nearly 2 decades. His criminal history included burglary, theft, robbery, and embezzlement. Most of those crimes are about taking things that do not belong to you, but embezzlement is different from the others. Embezzlement happens between strangers. You cannot embezzle from someone you don't trust first. The mechanism is always the same. Someone gives you access because they believe in you, and then you use that access for something they never intended. The trust comes first, the betrayal comes second. Hold that structure in mind, because the FBI's description of what happened in the Nancy Guthrie case follows almost exactly the same architecture. Someone had access, someone was trusted, someone was close enough to know things that strangers could not know, and then that access was sold. Investigators sat down with Dominic Evans. One interview, 40 minutes, and then nothing. No follow-up conversation, no public statement connecting him further to the case. For a man with a 17-year connection to the family, 40 minutes is a remarkably short amount of time. Whether it answered every question or simply answered the questions investigators thought to ask in that room on that day is something only they know. Former FBI Special Agent Steve Moore addressed the unclaimed reward directly on NewsNation. The total available between the Guthrie family's contribution and the FBI's addition had reached more than $1 million. In a case this public, this widely covered, this emotionally resonant, a reward that size going unclaimed for 6 weeks carries its own analytical weight. Moore was blunt about his conclusion. The most likely explanation, he said, is that the people who know something are guilty. They are not witnesses hesitating to come forward. They are participants, and the information that would unlock that reward cannot be shared without implicating the person who holds it. Now we need to zoom out, because this case did not happen in isolation. On the same night Nancy Guthrie was last seen alive, January 31st, 2026, something else was happening roughly 2 hours northeast of Tucson in Scottsdale, Arizona. 2 teenagers had driven up from California. They posed as delivery drivers. They forced their way into a private residence, bound the occupants with industrial tape, assaulted them, and demanded cryptocurrency. Their target had been selected because investigators believed the family held digital assets valued at approximately $66 million. The teenagers were arrested, and when investigators questioned them, they said something that opened a much larger door. They had not chosen that house themselves. They had not found that family on their own. They had been operating under orders, receiving instructions through Signal, an encrypted messaging platform, from 2 individuals they knew only by pseudonyms, Red and Ocho. Red and Ocho have not been identified. They have not been charged. As of this recording, they remain unknown. No official connection between the Scottsdale assault and the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie has been confirmed by authorities. Law enforcement has not stated publicly that these cases are linked. That matters, and it needs to be said clearly. But former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin Daffer noted publicly on March 15, 2026, that the structural similarities between the 2 cases were significant enough that the FBI could not ignore them. Look at the architecture side by side. Executors who traveled from California to Arizona to carry out an operation against a target they had been directed to. A target selected not by proximity or opportunity, but by financial profile, a ransom demand in cryptocurrency, an operational structure in which the people who physically committed the crime were separated from the people who planned it, with the planners communicating remotely and maintaining deliberate distance from the physical act itself. In Scottsdale, that structure was documented with precision. Pseudonyms, Signal, a chain of command that kept the architects invisible while the executors took the risk. If that same structure was applied to Nancy Guthrie, and Coffin Daffer was direct in saying the FBI was examining that possibility, then the man on the porch with the mask and the wrongly holstered gun and the Ozark Trail backpack was not the person who chose Nancy. He was the person who was sent to her door. The person who chose her, the person who identified her, located her, studied her, arranged for someone to provide detailed information about her home and her habits, and then directed the operation from a safe distance, that person has not appeared on any camera, has not been named, has not been charged. Coffin Daffer also raised a detail that had not received sufficient public attention. A search poster related to the Nancy Guthrie case was placed in Woodland Hills, California, a community in the western San Fernando Valley, part of the Los Angeles metropolitan corridor. The FBI does not place search posters at random. Every placement is a tactical decision, supported by operational intelligence. You put a poster somewhere because you have a reason to believe that someone in that area knows something. The location of that poster was a signal, not a routine distribution decision. The California thread runs through this case in multiple places, and it is worth tracing each one carefully. Derek Calla, the man arrested for sending fraudulent ransom messages to Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cian in the days after the disappearance, was from Hawthorne, California. He used a VoIP application to send messages asking if Bitcoin had been received, attempting to exploit the chaos of the early days of the investigation. Investigators traced the account back to his personal Gmail address, his full legal name, linked to the number he believed was untraceable. The FBI identified him within hours. He was charged with 2 federal counts, arrested, and released on bond. He had no actual connection to the crime. He was an opportunist who saw a public crisis and tried to extract money from it. But the Calla case demonstrated something important beyond his own actions. Within 48 hours of the family's public video asking for Nancy's return, a stranger in California had gathered enough personal information about Annie Guthrie and Tommaso Cian, including their contact details and the specific Bitcoin demand that had been publicly reported, to send targeted, personalized messages to both of them. He found Annie's contact information. He found Tommaso's. Tommaso Cian is not a public figure by choice. He's a teacher. He plays bass in a local band. His professional profile is documented in school records and band pages and institutional materials, but he is not someone whose phone number should be easy to find. Calla found it in less than 2 days, using nothing more sophisticated than internet searches. Someone with weeks of preparation and a specific objective, as investigators believe the real planners had, would have found considerably more. The Scottsdale attackers were California residents. The fake ransom sender was from California. The FBI placed a search poster in California. The VoIP traces in the Calla case pointed back to California registered accounts. Each of these data points exists independently. Authorities have not confirmed they form a single investigative thread, but they form a geographic pattern, and the FBI has acted on that pattern in ways that are visible, even if the underlying intelligence driving those actions is not. The second theory was laid out by journalist Megyn Kelly in her public analysis of the case. Kelly's hypothesis, stated directly on her program, was that this was not a kidnapping at all. It was a murder disguised as one. Someone with a personal motive to harm Nancy or to harm the Guthrie family entered that home with a plan that was never about money. The ransom framework was cover. The notes were misdirection, designed to make a crime with a completely different motive appear to be a financial transaction. Nancy was taken and disposed of, and what was presented to the world as a kidnapping for profit was, from the beginning, something else entirely. Kelly's analysis rested on the absence of any real proof of life, the failure of the ransom contacts to follow the patterns of genuine kidnapping for profit operations, and the possibility that whoever wrote those notes was not trying to collect money, but to shape the narrative that investigators and the public would follow. Both theories share one foundation that is not a theory at all. It is confirmed, documented, stated on the record by the sheriff of Pima County himself. Nancy Guthrie was a deliberate target. She was studied, she was selected, she was chosen. And the person or people who chose her understood enough about her life, her home, her schedule, and her vulnerabilities to plan an operation that required a hired informant, weeks of on-site reconnaissance, a signal jammer, a specific approach to a specific door, and a 25-liter backpack. What remains open as of this recording, a mixed DNA profile found inside Nancy's home that does not match Nancy or any member of her known circle, currently being processed through forensic genealogy. A glove recovered approximately 3 kilometers from the property, consistent in type with what the suspect wore on the doorbell footage, DNA extracted and submitted to the federal CODIS database. Surveillance images from motion sensors in the pool and garden area of the property, showing individuals present before the abduction, still under analysis. A damaged utility box near the property, the nature and relevance of the damage classified. A search poster in Woodland Hills, California, still standing. A reward of over $1 million, still unclaimed. And Red and Ocho, whoever they are, still unidentified. Before I let you go, a genuine thank you. If you have watched this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. People who want the full picture, not just the headlines. Notebook V is built for you. Leave your theory in the comments below. Do you think this was a failed ransom operation or something far darker from the very beginning? Subscribe if you have not already, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we will see you in the next one. Savannah Guthrie went back to Tucson in October 2025 as an act of love. She sat across from her mother at a table inside a restaurant she had probably been going to her whole life, asked her on camera what made Tucson feel like home, and millions of people watched. That afternoon is now part of a federal investigation. Nancy Guthrie did not do anything wrong. Going to your favorite restaurant is not a crime. Telling the world what you love about the city you have called home for 50 years is not a crime. Sitting with your daughter under television lights and saying the air is wonderful and the quality of life is laid back and gentle, that is not a crime. But it may have been the moment a private woman became visible to the one person who should never have seen her. The investigation is still active. The reward is unclaimed. The DNA is still being processed. The answers are getting closer. They are still looking for Nancy.